responses that reinforce victimization and powerlessness. So in a sense, you don't even need to interview the participant because you assume that the participant is going to say, well, yeah, you know, I would just be there by myself and he would ask me something, but I deserved it and he hit me. Right? The idea is, sure, this is the case, right? Sure, this happened, but that's not a good interview question, right? A good interview question would assume and challenge the very notion of powerlessness, right? It would, and this is important, right? A good interview question with respect to the victim would challenge the notion of powerlessness. Let me ask you, in your relationship with your husband, can you think of a time where you might have been more powerful than him, where you might have manipulated a situation with him, where you might have justified some wrongdoing? See what she says. See what he says, right? With respect to soliciting sympathy, is there a sense in which, and this you know, and you'd have to get all these questions approved, but interview question, a perfect example of sort of a generalization, is there a sense in which the family was there to help you during your time of need? Well, yeah, of course the family was there to help me during my time of need. The dude beat me up, my family's there to help me. I mean, the point is, what am I gaining from asking that question other than an answer that reinforces the assumptions, right? That, for me, it's a question, granted, but it's not a viable question. And the question is, why isn't it viable? Because you're reinforcing the assumptions that are already there. Therefore, the participant, the lived experience of the person isn't really as valid, right? So it really isn't about bold-faced, sort of static assumptions between relationships between victims and perpetrators. And this is not an easy thing to navigate in any sense, right? And I'm not saying that, obviously I've said this, I've done this disclaimer many times throughout the last few minutes. It's a recognition that, yes, there are individuals who are rightfully classified as victims and you can check off all of these characteristics. But it is not the case that all victims have these characteristics. It's a state of flux. Your assessment as a qualitative researcher is not to make the assumption, but to find out what exactly classifies as the interpretive lived experience of your participant by asking the participant meaningful questions so that you can have an understanding of the complexity of their victimhood, right? Yeah, you know, I was victimized, but the truth is I recognize that my relationship with, this is just an example and a gross example, but my relationship with my husband was that we didn't know how to communicate, and I wanted to communicate, so I would prefer to argue with him than to remain silent. So I would evoke anger so that we could at least talk. Wow! Don't you see how that's abusive power in your end, right? That you have, oh wow, the story's a little bit more complicated now. This is a little bit more meaningful of a discussion, right? So the idea is we have to get beneath the surface, right? Beneath the assumptions. That's the whole point of qualitative methods research, because nothing is as it appears, right? Nothing is as it appears. And the point is, here's the appearance, what's the truth? Number 3, these assumptions will influence how a researcher interprets the participant's story, right? So, insofar as my recorder is going and the participant is talking and I'm asking questions, a good researcher isn't focusing on the details. That's why you have the recorder on. I'll assess the details after the fact. Right now, for me at least, it's a motive, and I'll talk about this later. It's a motive. The setting of the room, the body language of the participant, my body language projected to the participant. I want to make the participant as comfortable as possible to try and get as much emotive response from the participant as I can possibly get. Later I'll do analysis, but I'm not analyzing while I'm talking. With respect to my interpretation of the narrative, as it said in number 4, right? My assessment of the person's story. If it's the case that I forget my role as objective analyst, and the person is telling me a story about their victimhood, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm thinking in my mind, this person, I'm so sad, I can't believe that happened, and it cripples my ability as an analyst, right? My ability as an analyst is then undermined by my emotional attachment to the story. If, back to the example I gave like an hour ago, if the doctor has a patient that comes in with bullet wounds to the chest, and the doctor is so hysterically, emotionally attached to the patient, is hysterical crying, it impedes her ability to save the life of the patient. So if the participant, it's not that you're not empathetic to the story of the participant, it's not that you don't offer condolence to the plight or the suffering, what have you, of the participant, but if you are so emotionally attached to the narrative of the participant, you're not going to be able to navigate. Because at every instance in qualitative methods research, especially in an interview, a lot of it is scripted, which is what I'm doing now. I'm trying to give you sort of the codified rules to help guide you. But after you learn this, right, a lot of it is going to be sort of ad hoc, off the cuff. It's something that you got to practice, right? Oh, they said this. Okay, let me change my direction a little bit and see what else I can get with respect to that. They said that. I have questions, but it's not like I'm just going to be like, number one says, ask the participant. No, right? You have to have a certain distance, objective distance, from the narrative that your participant is going to have in order to viably give them and give their story any credence. So if I am too emotionally attached to their victimhood status or too emotionally attached to their perpetrator status, when I go back to report my findings, it's going to be soppy. It's going to be like, the poor participant suffered in emotionally biased research, very problematic. If it's perpetrator, they're all bad, they're all evil, the group of people are just, inhuman, dehumanized, it's going to cause me a lot of problems, right? Rather than objectively stating, in my interview with X said Y, my assessment of X and Y relates to these historical findings, and I think that it might be generalized on this account. I mean, for me personally, I like that mode of writing. It's not for everybody, but either way, no matter how you report your findings, you do need to have some objective distance from the participant's story. And then lastly, number 5, these assumptions will influence the level of sympathy, empathy. Distinction, basically, empathy you can understand because in some sense you've lived it, experienced it. Sympathy, you can place yourself in the individual's shoes conceptually, right? So these assumptions will influence the level of sympathy, empathy a reader will have for both the participant and the participant's story, right? If I make an assumption that because the person is a victim, that this is just what it is, then insofar as the participant relays his story or her story, I'm immediately going to say, oh, well, yeah, I understand what you're going through. I get it. It's a huge problem. Oh, you were domestically abused? Oh, yeah, I know what that's about. Yeah, you were a victim, you were powerless, you were scared, right. I believe you because everything you're saying is true, blah, blah, blah. You don't get it. You don't understand. You couldn't understand unless you also were a victim yourself, right? So for me, this is the biggest point in my own personal dissertation because my assumptions were sort of undermined, they completely undermined my assumptions were undermined by my findings. I thought in my assumptions that I was doing an epistemological framework of evil, and I thought I would, before I interviewed the Holocaust survivors, I would have an understanding of their experience, right? To some sense, right? They would be very graphic, and they would tell me things, and I would better empathize and understand, only to find out that after, and I interviewed, a lot of people, every single participant told me, unequivocally, you'll never understand what I'm talking about. You might think you understand, but you really don't understand what it's like to be in that level of trauma, that level of violence, that level of horror, unless you're actually there. It's not that my research was bad research. It was that my research was legitimate research, and that was my finding. My ultimate finding was the ineffability of transcendental evil, of evil on the biggest scope, right? And not transcendental in some other world, like not otherworldly evil, but just evil on, genocidal level. The idea is, I was open as a researcher to whatever the participant was going to throw at me. I didn't go into the research in the interview with the Holocaust survivors saying, they're going to tell me about trauma and I'm going to totally get it. Or I know what they're going to say, they were in a camp and the camp life was bad. I had people who were in camps, I had people who weren't in camps. I had people who experienced high levels of abuse and high levels of trauma, and people who were